I'm glad you're here. Not in a dramatic way. Just here. Taking a moment to sit down, even if your body is still tired, even if your mind hasn't slowed yet. You don't have to feel anything specific right now. You don't have to understand why you decided to listen. You can just let this moment be what it is. I want to speak slowly, because this isn't a place where we rush. It's not a place where anything needs to be fixed. It's simply a small pause, set aside from everything that usually asks something from you. I don't know what your day has been like. Maybe you've already carried more than you expected to. Maybe you've been making decisions all day, for other people, for things that depend on you, or maybe you've been quiet on the outside, while a lot has been moving inside. As you're listening, I'm curious about something. How does your body feel right now? Not how you think it should feel, just how it actually feels. Are your shoulders tight? Is your jaw clenched without you noticing? Or are you simply tired in a way that doesn't have a clear name? You don't need to answer out loud. You don't need to explain it to yourself. Just noticing is enough. There's no expectation here. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to take anything with you when this ends. You're allowed to listen from wherever you are, exactly as you are. Sometimes we move through our days holding a lot on our own, so quietly that no one sees it. And even then, we keep going. Not because we're trying to be strong, but because there isn't really another option in that moment. If that sounds familiar, you're not required to do anything about it right now. You can just stay here, listening. Let this be a space where nothing is demanded of you. We'll take this one step at a time. At that time, my days didn't have clear edges. Morning and night blended into each other, not because I was busy in a dramatic way, but because decisions kept lining up, one after another. Each one needed an answer. Not later. Not after more discussion. An answer that would set things in motion. From the outside, it probably looked like there were many people involved. Meetings, conversations, messages going back and forth. There were voices, opinions, concerns, suggestions. But when it came down to the moment where a direction had to be chosen, the room felt quieter than it appeared. These weren't small decisions. They affected the path of a whole group of people. They shaped what would be focused on, what would be delayed, what would be risked, and what would be let go of. Once a decision was made, it couldn't really be undone without consequences. The pressure didn't come from working long hours. It came from knowing that the final responsibility didn't spread evenly. Advice could be shared, input could be gathered, but the weight of the outcome stayed in one place. I remember sitting with information that was incomplete. Some things were clear, others were not. There were numbers that could be calculated, but also unknowns that couldn't be reduced to data. No option felt fully safe. Each path closed off another. There were moments when I paused before speaking, not because I was unsure what to say, but because I knew that once I said it, things would move. People would act based on it. Time, energy, and trust would follow that direction. Even with others around, sharing that kind of pressure felt limited. Not because they didn't care, but because the nature of the role changed how much could really be placed on someone else. You can't ask others to carry a decision that isn't theirs to make. So the days continued in that space. Alert, careful, always aware that a misstep wouldn't just be personal. It would ripple outward. There wasn't panic. There wasn't chaos. Just a steady awareness that the margin for error was thin. That whatever happened next would trace back to these choices, made quietly, often without much room to explain the weight behind them. From where I was standing, things were still unfolding. Nothing had resolved yet. There was no clear sign pointing to whether the direction was right or wrong. Only the reality of moving forward, carrying the responsibility as it was, in real time, inside that period. There was a kind of tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep. It sat deeper than that. I could rest for a few hours and still wake up already feeling behind, already bracing for what needed to be held that day. There wasn't really a place to complain, not because I believed I wasn't allowed to, but because I didn't know how to do it without adding weight to someone else. When people asked how things were going, the easiest answer was, fine. Not a lie, just incomplete. I learned how to keep my voice steady even when my thoughts weren't. How to listen carefully, while part of my attention stayed on the next decision, waiting in line. How to nod, respond, move forward, even on days when my body felt slower than my responsibilities. There were moments when I questioned myself quietly, not in a dramatic way, more like a low, persistent, wondering, did I miss something obvious? Was I pushing in the wrong direction without realizing it? Those questions didn't stop the work. They just walked alongside it. I didn't feel free to pause for long. Things were already in motion, and stopping felt heavier than continuing. So I kept going, carrying doubt without giving it a name, letting it exist in the background while decisions still had to be made. The loneliness wasn't sharp. It didn't arrive all at once. It stretched out, subtle and consistent, like a quiet room after everyone has left. Even when conversations filled the day, there was a sense that certain thoughts stayed with me alone. I noticed it most at the end of the day, when there was nothing left to respond to immediately. No one asking for input, no one waiting for an answer. That was when the weight settled in, without urgency, without noise. I didn't feel misunderstood, and I didn't feel abandoned. It was something simpler than that. Just the awareness that some parts of this role couldn't be shared, no matter how capable or willing others might be. There were times I felt close to the edge of my own energy. Not burned out, not collapsing, just thin. Like I was operating with very little space between what was required and what I had left. Still, the days continued. I showed up. I answered questions. I made calls. From the outside, things probably looked stable. Inside, it felt like holding a steady posture for a long time. Not painful enough to stop. Not comfortable enough to forget. That was the emotional landscape then. Ongoing, quiet, unresolved. At some point during that time, something shifted. Not in a way that changed the situation. Not in a way that made things easier. It was quieter than that. I noticed that I had been spending a lot of energy trying to push the loneliness away. Not directly. More like resisting it without naming it. Staying busy. Staying alert. Filling the space so I wouldn't have to sit with it for too long. And then there was a moment, not a single day, not a clear line, where I stopped doing that as much. Not because I accepted it fully, but because fighting it wasn't working. The feeling didn't disappear when I ignored it, and it didn't grow smaller when I tried to outwork it. It just stayed there, steady, waiting. I began to see that this wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't a sign that I was handling things wrong. It was simply part of what came with the position I was in. Some roles come with shared weight. Others don't. When you're the one expected to decide, there are limits to how much of that decision can be placed in someone else's hands. You can explain your thinking. You can listen to concerns. But the final step still belongs to you. Realizing that didn't bring relief. It didn't make the days lighter, but it did make them clearer. I stopped expecting the loneliness to be solved by the right conversation or the right moment. I stopped waiting for someone to step in and carry it with me in the exact way I wanted. Instead, I adjusted how I stood inside it. Not stronger, just more grounded. I began to let the feeling exist without immediately reacting to it. Without treating it as something that needed to be fixed before I could continue. It became something I moved alongside, rather than something blocking the path. There was still pressure. There was still uncertainty. But there was less friction inside my own response to it. I understood, in a very practical sense, that responsibility doesn't always come with company. And that didn't mean something was missing. It meant the role was what it was. Nothing resolved in that moment. Nothing closed neatly. The situation kept unfolding as before. But my relationship to that quiet wait changed slightly. Enough to keep going. Looking back now, with some distance from that period, the loneliness doesn't stand out as something dramatic. It doesn't feel heavy in the way it once did. It feels specific. I don't see it as something that made me different from others. And I don't see it as something that elevated the experience into anything meaningful on its own. It wasn't a badge. It wasn't a burden meant to prove anything. It was simply there, because of the position I chose to stay in. For a long time, I thought loneliness at that level meant something was wrong, either with the situation or with me. I assumed that if things were working properly, that sense of being alone would eventually disappear, that someone would step in, that the weight would spread out naturally. But that's not how it actually works. Some responsibilities don't become lighter just because more people are present. They remain concentrated, not out of unfairness, but out of structure. Someone has to be the point where decisions stop being discussed and start being carried. When I look back, I don't think of myself as stronger for having done that. And I don't feel regret for the moments when it felt isolating. Those feelings don't cancel each other out. They coexist without needing to be ranked. What becomes clearer with time is that loneliness, in this context, wasn't a personal experience. It was a functional one. It came from choosing not to step away when things were unclear, from staying present when outcomes were uncertain, from being willing to let decisions trace back to me, even when the result wasn't guaranteed. That doesn't make the experience noble. It just makes it honest. When people talk about leadership, they often describe confidence, vision, strength. Those words sound clean. They suggest clarity. What they don't always describe is the quieter part. The part where you live with the consequences of your own judgment. Not publicly, not loudly, but consistently. Looking back, I see that being the one in front wasn't about being the most capable person in the room. It was about being the one who stayed with the decision after it was made. The one who didn't outsource responsibility when things became uncomfortable. That's not something to admire blindly, and it's not something to avoid at all costs. It's just one way responsibility shows up. I also see now that loneliness didn't mean there was no support. There were people around me. There were conversations, shared efforts, collaboration. But support doesn't always take the shape we want when we're under pressure. Sometimes it means people walking alongside you, even if they can't stand exactly where you're standing. And sometimes it means understanding that no one else can occupy that exact position without changing the role itself. From where I am now, the experience feels complete, not resolved in a tidy way, but understood. It doesn't define me, and it doesn't fade into nothing either. It sits in its proper place, as part of a period where responsibility outweighed comfort, and presence mattered more than reassurance. When I think about it this way, there's no pride attached, and there's no resentment left behind. Just a clear recognition of what it was, and what it wasn't. And perhaps that clarity is the only thing time really adds. From where I am now, there are a few things I've come to see more clearly. Not as rules, not as conclusions that apply to everyone, just as understandings that formed slowly, after living inside that kind of responsibility for a while. One of them is this: some weight simply doesn't divide evenly. That doesn't mean people around you aren't willing, and it doesn't mean you failed to ask in the right way. It just means certain roles come with a center of gravity, and once you step into them, that gravity doesn't disappear because others are nearby. Another thing I noticed is how quiet things can become when you're the one holding that center. Not dramatic silence, just the absence of small check-ins. No one asking, "Are you okay?" No one stopping to see how you're holding up. For a long time, I thought that silence meant something about me, that maybe I should have been handling things better, or that needing acknowledgement was a sign of weakness. I don't see it that way anymore. Sometimes people don't ask because they assume you're managing. Sometimes because they don't know how to help without crossing a boundary, and sometimes because your role makes it unclear where support would even fit. None of that says anything about your strength or your limits. I also learned that feeling lonely while carrying responsibility doesn't cancel out the value of what you're doing. It doesn't mean the effort is misplaced. And it doesn't mean you've chosen the wrong path. It simply means the experience has a cost. When I look at it this way, the loneliness becomes more neutral. Still present, sometimes, but not loaded with judgment. If you find yourself in a similar place, holding things together quietly, making decisions others rely on, there isn't a single correct way to interpret that experience. You don't need to frame it as sacrifice, and you don't need to frame it as failure. You get to decide what it means, if it means anything at all. What mattered for me was recognizing that I didn't need to justify the weight I was carrying, either to myself or to anyone else. And I didn't need to turn it into a story about endurance or strength. It was enough to acknowledge it honestly. You might recognize some of this in your own life, or you might not. Both are fine. You're allowed to name your experience in your own language. You're allowed to see it as temporary, or ongoing, or unresolved, and you're allowed to hold it quietly, without explaining it to anyone. Nothing here requires agreement. Nothing here asks you to change how you're living. These are just perspectives that came into focus for me after spending time inside that space. You can take what feels relevant. You can leave the rest where it is. The meaning, in the end, isn't something I can define for you. It belongs with you. Thank you for staying with this all the way to the end. Not in a ceremonial sense. Just thank you for giving this time your attention. I know time isn't something most people have in excess. It's usually taken from somewhere else. From rest, from quiet, from moments that already feel full. So, the fact that you chose to listen, even briefly, matters. There's nothing you need to do with what you heard. You don't have to hold on to it. You don't have to remember it later. You're allowed to let it pass, the same way a thought does when it's no longer needed. As this comes to a close, there's no message to carry forward. No direction to follow. No next step waiting for you. Just the space you're already standing in. Whatever responsibilities are part of your life will still be there after this. Whatever questions you're holding don't need answers right now, and whatever strength you rely on doesn't need to be proven or measured. You can return to your day at your own pace. Slowly, if that's possible, or simply as you are. I'm grateful you listened. That's all. Take care of the rest in the way that makes sense to you.